Christian Spirituality in the Catholic Tradition, Part 11. Bonaventure. The three principal names in Franciscan learning are Saint Bonaventure, Saint Anthony of Padua, and John Duns Scotus. Numerous others, of course, must be added to the total list: John of Rochelle, Alexander of Hales, John Peckham, Roger Bacon, Peter Auriol, Francis de Meyrones, Nicholas of Lyre, William of Ockham, and John of Ripa. We shall restrict our study to Saint Bonaventure, whom Pope Leo XIII called the Prince of Mystics, and whom would many hail as a second founder of the Franciscan order. We can surely assert with safety that he is the greatest theologian of the spiritual life among the Franciscans. Queyra says of him, he carried on the tradition of Alexander of Hales and prepared the way for Duns Scotus, who gave the final form to Franciscan Augustinism. Saint Bonaventure, 1221 to 1276, was a contemporary of St. Thomas Aquinas at the University of Paris. Although they differed radically in their ideas, they were very close personal friends, as were Francis and Dominic before them. They differed not only in their approach to theology. Bonaventure was voluntaristic and mystical, while Thomas was intellectual and analytic, but also their definitions of theology, as Congar explains. For St. Bonaventure, theology is a production of grace. It is to be considered a consequence of the communications which God gave us of himself. Theology, therefore, is situated for St. Bonaventure between faith and appearance. The first light received from God is reason, but when Bonaventure considers reason's concrete possibilities, he severely limits them, since he claims that man in his present state cannot come to know superior truth simply by reason. However, this does not mean that philosophy is not the first step towards wisdom. In order of grace and Christian wisdom, progress towards the perfect possession of wisdom is marked by three stages or grades. First, the grade of virtues, in which faith opens our eyes to help us find God in everything. Next, the grade of gifts, and third, the grade of beatitudes. Now the acts of virtue, gifts, and beatitudes are respectively defined as credere, believing, intelligere, credita, understanding the things believed, and videre intellecta, seeing the things understood. Hence, this knowledge of mysteries, which is the object of theology, is for Bonaventure an intermediary stage between the simple assent to faith and the vision. Theology, for St. Bonaventure, is a gift of God. Hence, it is not a purely intellectual gift. It presupposes not a dead faith, but a living faith of prayer, the exercise of the virtues, and the yearning for a union of charity with God. Here we arrive at an essential point, where the theology of Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas are clearly distinguished. For the latter, theology is the growth of the convictions of faith and the construction in these convictions into a body of knowledge consonant with human reason. Like all things, it develops under God's providence and is rooted in supernatural faith, but it is strictly a rational construction. The wisdom of theology is distinguished from the infused gift of wisdom, which develops as an experimental and effective body of knowledge. On the other hand, theology is an intellectual wisdom acquired by personal effort, which tries intellectually to comprehend and reconstruct the order of works and the mysteries of God by tying them up in the mystery of God himself. St. Bonaventure's theological masterpiece is his commentary on the Book of Sentences by Peter Lombard, and almost everything else that he wrote is in some ways based on this work. The fundamental characteristic of this doctrine is that it is traditional, following the teaching of St. Augustine through Alexander of Hales. His principal writings on the spiritual life are Brevio Quium, De Triplica Via, Itinerarum Mentis ad Deum, Soliloquium Dequatur Mentibus Exercises, and Ligum Vitae. And it is in the field of spiritual theology that Bonaventure excels. Smeat says that the works of St. Bonaventure manifest not only his orthodoxy, but his sanctity and virtues. They show that the holy doctor was permeated with the Franciscan spirit, and that he had no other guide than his seraphic father, St. Francis. This is particularly evident in Bonaventure's conciseness of style, humble submission to authority, veneration of theologians, respect for the opinions of others, and his calm and peaceful temperament. De Wolf says of Bonaventure that his mysticism in the incarnation of the best of 13th century mysticism, this is another way of saying that the spiritual doctrine of St. Bonaventure is the traditional doctrine taught by St. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, and St. Bernard in the school of St. Victor. His spiritual doctrine is eminently Christocentric, and while he argues with Thomas Aquinas that the purpose of the incarnation was the redemption, he sees Christ as the center of the entire created universe. The fundamental virtue of Christian spirituality is humility. Grace is a likeness to God which is received both by the soul and its faculties. The essence of Christian perfection is charity, which is perfected as wisdom, to which the mystical graces are related. Contemplation is the perfection of charity and wisdom, and it is much more a savory experience of God than it is the vision. It is entirely passive and infused and unusually accompanied by some form of ecstasy, which Bonaventure calls excessus. St. Bonaventure canonized the classification of the spiritual life into three ways, and uses the same terminology as Pseudo-Dionysius: purgative, illuminative, and unitive or perfect. He does not see them as progressive and separate stages, however, although at a given time one or another will predominate. The ultimate goal for all Christians is holiness as they pass through the various stages of spiritual growth. Each one bestows its own fault. Thus, the purgative way leads to peace of soul and is characterized by meditation, examination of conscience, and consideration of the Passion of Christ. The illuminative way leads to truth, and its predominant exercise are consideration of the benefits received from God and frequent meditation on the passion and death of Christ. The unitive way terminates in charity, union with God through love, and awareness of the divine beauty through the contemplation of Trinity. Multiplication of religious orders. In spite of the prohibition of the Fourth Lateran Council, there was a remarkable increase in religious institutes during the first half of the 13th century. Some of them were not really new, however, but were a modernization and adaptation of ancient orders, such as Carmelites and Augustinians. Others were inspired by the mendicant friars, Dominicans and Franciscans, who had such a prodigious expansion and were so favored by the Holy See. Many of the institutes had only a local character and ceased to exist after a time. In fact, the Council of Lyons in 1274 abolished 22 religious institutes that had not been approved by the Holy See. But what should be noted, both in the newly founded institutes and the outgrowths of ancient orders, is the increasing emphasis on the apostolate and a noticeable decline in the number of religious dedicated to a purely contemplative life. As time passed, this placed contemplative institutes somewhat on the defense, but for the time being, even the institutes dedicated to an apostolic or ministry were constrained to follow a monastic or conventual type of life. One of the problems was that so many institutes were identical in life and mission. Among the canons regular, we note first of all that the canons of St. Augustine were already in existence, and they consisted of cathedral chapters or communities following the rules of St. Augustine. But in the 12th and 13th century, several religious institutes were founded under the title of the Cross. The Crozier Canons, founded by Theodore de Celles, a canon of Liege, in 1210, were formally approved in 1248. The rule of the Croziers is based on the Dominican constitutions, and the early members were dedicated to preaching the Crusades and the care of pilgrims. After its approbation, however, the Crozier order followed the mixed life and began to engage in missionary work. It flourished especially in the lowlands. The hermits of St. Augustine, who were much less given to contemplation than their name indicates, were formed out of a group of hermits in Italy who adopted the rule of St. Augustine. They were approved by Pope Alexander IV in 1256 and classified among the mendicant friars with the Dominicans and Franciscans. Eventually, the name Hermits of St. Augustine fell into disuse, since they dedicated themselves to all types of apostolate and priestly ministry. Another group that began with an eremitical spirit was the Servants of Mary, popularly known as the Servites. Founded by 7 businessmen who desired to live a life of austerity and penance, with special devotion to the Blessed Virgin, they followed the observances of the mendicant friars. They made their first foundation at Florence, Italy, in 1233, and, like most of these new institutes, they also made provisions for a feminine branch. 2 other orders of friars that had glorious history were the Mercedarians, founded by St. Peter Nolasco and aided by the Dominican St. Raymond of Peñafort, and the Trinitarians. Both of these orders were founded for the redemption of captives, and consequently their field of labor was at first among the Moors, and later in Latin America. In modern times, however, their membership has greatly decreased. Finally, the Order of Our Lady of Mount Carmel came into prominence in the 13th century. although its origins go back to Mount Carmel in Palestine. Early in the 13th century, some Latin hermits lived on Mount Carmel, and in due time, for a variety of reasons, the Carmelites spread to Europe. Saint Simon Stock died in 1265, gradually adapted the Carmelite rule in life to a semi-apostolate religious institute, and in 1245 the Carmelites were classified among the mendicant orders. The, Car- the Carmelite hermits ceased to exist in 1291 when the remaining members were murdered by the Muslims. But at that time, the Carmelites of Europe had committed themselves to a predominantly active life. Characteristics of the 13th century were basically the same as those we listed in the 12th century, with the addition of remarkable influence of the newly founded religious institutes dedicated to the apostolate and the publication of numerous books and manuals on the basic dogmas and moral instruction. As a result, there was a flourishing of lay groups desirous of living an exemplary Christian life. Most notable among them were the Begghards and the Beguines. They did not feel called to religious life, nor did they want to be anchorites. Normally they grouped themselves around a religious order. The Begghards and the Beguines originated in northern France, the lowlands, and the Rhineland. Although they lived a community life, they took no vows, and they lived a celibate life and were obedient as long as they remained in the Beguinage. They occupied themselves with sewing and embroidery, visiting the sick, caring for the elderly, and sometimes the education of children. They assisted at the liturgy in a group at a neighboring church, and after 6 years of formation they could obtain permission to live as a recluse. In their time, the simplicity of their life caused the Begghards and the Beguines to be the object of criticism and suspicion. Later they were openly attacked for their use of the vernacular for Bible reading and for their interpretation of Scripture. In 1311 they were officially condemned by the Council of Vienna. The doctrinal basis for the condemnation was quietism and a latent pantheism. Marie d'Agnose died 1213, was one of the leaders of the movement, had an intense love for Christ and desired especially to imitate his poverty. The poor Christ, or Christ as a beggar, was a predominant object of her veneration and imitation. Juliana of Cornelian, 1258, also belonged to a community of Beguines and was one of the promoters of the Feast of Corpus Christi, first approved for the Diocese of Liege in 1246, and for the Universal Church by Pope Urban IV in 1264. But the most famous of the Beguines was Hadewich of Antwerp, because of her written accounts of her visions and her letters and poetry. Her dominant theme was that the soul can attain union with God only through ecstatic love, and that this union takes place on the symbolism of the mystical marriage. This constitutes the Braut mystique, and seems to have been a favorite concept with the mystics of the lowlands and the Rhineland. There is also the writings of Hedewig that suggests of the Wesen mystic that will be developed further later by Meister Eckhart. Hedewig is thus a forerunner of the Rhineland mystics. Chapter 7. Dionysian Spirituality and Devotio Moderna. Following Kyrie, we have decided to designate this chapter as the Dionysian Spirituality, but the title requires explanation. First of all, it refers to a revival of Neoplatonic Augustinian spirituality by the German Dominicans, who then influenced the Christian life in the Netherlands. Secondly, while dependent on the Dominican intellectual tradition, it swings away from that tradition towards the mystical and contemplative spirituality of Pseudo-Dionysus, who lived around the year 500. Thirdly, it resulted in the expansion of spiritual influence from the Latin countries to the Germanic and Anglo-Saxon countries, introducing at the same time a classification of schools of spirituality according to national cultures and temperaments. The leader of this new school was Meister Eckhart, a German Dominican who was later accused of pantheistic tendencies. His disciples included John Tauler and Henry Suso, both German Dominicans, and John Ruysbroek in the Netherlands. In England, a more moderate form of Dionysian spirituality was taught by Richard Rolle, Walter Hilton, and the author of The Cloud of Unknowing. Mention should also be made of the Carthusian Denis Riekel, who in the same school of spirituality and brings the Middle Ages to a close as far as spiritual theology is concerned. Before noting the contributions of each of the outstanding figures in Dionysian spirituality, we should investigate the circumstances that led to the emergence and success of this spiritual movement. Although theologians of the stature of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure had written about mystical contemplation, it was not until the 14th century that the subject became the object of intense and specialized study. One of the principal situations that favored this theological development was the increasing number of fervent and educated women who were claiming various types of mystical experience and seeking spiritual direction as a result of it. Early in the 14th century, there was an amazing number of religious women who composed spiritual treatises in which they described their mystical experiences, many of them being accounts of the mystical espousal or mystical marriage. Eventually, this mysticism of spiritual marriage, became one of the chief characteristics of Eckhart's mysticism of the essence. That this movement had its excesses, there is no doubt, for Sitwell observes that in the 14th century the whole of the Rhine Valley was seething with religious enthusiasts, Beguines and Begards and brethren of the free spirit, some of them controlled and respectable, some of them not. As early as 1292, the Council of Aschaffenburg initiated a repression of the Begards and the Beguines. In 1306, the Council of Cologne accuses them of infamy and heresy and blaming them for instigating attacks on the Franciscans and Dominicans. Finally, the Council of Vienne, 1311, condemned 8 of their doctrinal positions and denounced their pseudo-mysticism. Yet, not all the Begards and Beguines were deserving of condemnation. Mechtilde Magdeburg is an outstanding example of a Beguine who rose to the heights of the mystical life, and together with Gertrude in St. Michael of Hackenborn is a jewel in the crown of Cistercian monastery at Helfta. The Mystics of Helfta. The ruins of the Cistercian monastery at Helfta still stand in Saxony, near Isabel. Founded by Gertrude Hackborn, it produced 3 saintly women whose writings had a tremendous influence on Christian life in Germany during the late Middle Ages. The first of these, Mechthild of Magdeburg, belonged to a community of Beguines who were closely associated with Cistercian nuns, and was ready in the mystical state before she entered the monastery at Helfta in 1270. In the monastery she wrote the last chapter of a work she had been composing under the direction of her Dominican director, The Flowing Light of the Divinity. Written in Low German, it was later revised in High German and translated into Latin by Henry Nordlingen. The book describes the mystical experience in ecstatic union in the form of a dialogue between Christ and the soul. The fundamental point in the teaching of Mechthild is that the soul must be empty of everything that comes to it through the senses, the memory and the imagination, even of its own virtues, in order to attain union with God. There, in the very essence of the soul, in its purest state, the transforming union occurs. Following in the tradition of Saint Bernard, Mechthild's teaching is eminently Christocentric in that it contributes to the mysticism of essence that will be popularized later by Meister Eckhart. Saint Mechthild of Hackborn was a sister of the foundress of Helfta, and she became the mistress of novices. Under her guidance many saintly nuns were formed. Among them was Saint Gertrude the Great. Saint Mechthild of Hackborn was renowned as a confidant of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and a leader in the propagation of this devotion. Saint Mechthild never wanted to write about the numerous graces she had received from God, but Gertrude the Great made a transcription of these things and gave it to Mechthild for her approval. In this way, Saint Mechthild's work, the Book of Special Grace, came into being. It is a book filled with joy and thanksgiving, without any mention of pain or suffering. The work was widely circulated because it served as a guide for Christian living. It treated of the Christian virtues, devotion to the heart of Jesus, and Mechthild's numerous revelations. It also provided instructions for the reception of communion, the practice of prayer, and participation in the liturgy. Saint Gertrude the Great was received into the monastery school at Helfta at the age of 5 by the foundress Gertrude of Hackborn. She was a brilliant student and became so absorbed in literary pursuits that she neglected her spiritual development. As a result of a vision of Christ in 1281, at the age of 26, Gertrude henceforth dedicated herself in earnest to prayer and the reading of scriptures and the fathers of the Church, especially St. Augustine, St. Gregory of the Great, and St. Bernard, and Hugh of St. Victor. Gertrude's spiritual life was centered on the liturgy, and most of her mystical ecstasies occurred during Mass, usually as the result of certain words or phrases that captivated her full attention. Like St. Bernard, her spirituality was predominantly Christocentric. She had a great devotion to the Eucharist, to the Passion of Christ, to the wound in the side of Christ. In 1284, Gertrude received the stigmata in an invisible form and also experienced the transverberation of her heart. Between 1261 and 1302, St. Gertrude wrote The Herald of Divine Love, which some critics do not consider to be entirely her own, and her greatest work, Spiritual Exercises. The doctrinal basis of these works indicates a strong Dominican influence, but the overall tone is that of St. Bernard's Christology. St. Gertrude was an ardent devotee of the Sacred Heart, but she sees it as radiant with glory, a treasury of riches, a lamp suspended between heaven and earth, her dwelling place. There is nothing of suffering or reparation in her devotion to the heart of Jesus. Two other saintly women deserving of mention in this connection are Saint Lutgard and Saint Bridget of Sweden. A Cistercian nun, Saint Lutgard was also a promoter of devotion to the Sacred Heart, and she focused the entire theology of this devotion on love. Saint Bridget's spirituality was completely Cistercian, concentrating on the Passion of Christ and devotion to Mary. After a pilgrimage in Santiago de Compostela, Bridget's husband entered a Cistercian monastery in Sweden and died there a few years later. From that time on, St. Bridget was more and more directed by God towards a prophetic vocation, similar to that of St. Catherine of Siena. By God's command, she advised great rulers and ecclesiastical dignitaries. During a 6-month stay in the Holy Land, Bridget received numerous revelations concerning the passion and death of Christ, which were published for the first time in Lubeck in 1492. Bridget was also the foundress of an order of contemplative nuns dedicated to the praise of God and the reparation for sinners. Her book of Revelations received the approbation of Pope Benedict XIV as a private revelations and acceptable on human faith in accordance with prudence. Eckhart Tauler Suso. During the 14th century, the Dominicans and Franciscans were especially noteworthy for their spiritual ministrations to the cloistered nuns. At one point, however, a provincial chapter of the Dominican Germans had attempted to withdraw from this ministry, since so many friars were occupied solely with the spiritual care of nuns, but the Holy See insisted that this apostolate should continue. Then, in 1325, the chapter of Dominicans denounced those friars who were preaching the subtleties of the mystical life to persons who could easily misinterpret the doctrine. On the intellectual level, a group of German Dominicans, without any particular hostility to St. Thomas Aquinas, preferred the teaching of St. Albert the Great and the Neoplatonism of William of Moerbeke. Included amongst them are Hugh of Strasbourg, Ulrich of Strasbourg, and Thierry of Freiburg. In the 14th century, when Catholic spirituality inclined very strongly to the mystical element in Christian life and perfection, the Neoplatonic approach seemed to offer much more suitable vehicle of expression and description than did the speculative and closely reasoned Aristotelian approach of St. Thomas. Medieval spirituality was explicitly directed towards contemplation and spiritual experience. To attain this goal, Certain ascetical means were proposed: total renunciation of self, complete submission to the divine will, and rejection of all sense images. Even the humanity of Christ. This, they believed, would lead to a union with God which was so intimate that nothing could intervene between the soul and God as the bond of the union. It would consist in a divination that for all practical purposes leaves the soul indistinguishable from God. As could be expected, a doctrine of this type was especially susceptible to a pantheistic interpretation, and there seemed to be no doubt that some of the authors did make rash and excessive statements concerning the nature of the mystical union with God. On the other hand, one could hardly expect any writer to describe with clarity and precision the nature of the transforming union. Having surveyed the setting of the spirituality of the 14th century, we can turn our attention to the figures that emerged out of this scene and became the promoters of Dionysian spirituality. The leader, beyond any doubt, was the German Dominican Meister Eckhart. A renowned theologian and preacher, he also held numerous administrative posts of great importance in the Dominican order. As a young friar, Eckhart had studied at the Dominican Priory in Cologne, where St. Albert the Great died in 1280. Later he became prior at Erfurt and vicar general in Thuringia. On two separate occasions he was a professor of the University of Paris, but left there to be a prior and professor at the Dominican Priory in Strasbourg, ultimately returning to Cologne. It was there that Eckhart, now a famous preacher, became embroiled in controversy and was accused for unorthodox teaching. A forthright and intransigent man, he was also the victim of persecution at the hands of some of his own Dominican brethren. In 1326, the Franciscan Archbishop of Cologne, Henry of Wernberg, appointed 2 inquisitors to investigate the teachings of Eckhart, and from his writings and sermons, propositions which they considered suspect. Eckhart defended himself vigorously, but to no avail. He admitted that some of his statements, taken literally, could be interpreted in a heterodox sense, but it was never his intention to preach a doctrine that was contrary to orthodox theology. In 1327, in the Church of the Dominicans, he publicly revoked all such ill-sounding doctrine. In that same year Eckhart appealed to the Holy See, stating in advance his willingness to comply with any decision. He even defended himself at the papal court in Avignon, but died on his return to Cologne. In March 1329, Pope John the 22nd condemned 28 propositions from the teachings of Eckhart. The first 15 and the last 2 were condemned as erroneous and heretical, and others were condemned as ill-sounding and rash. As a theologian, Eckhart was a faithful follower of the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas concerning the supremacy of the intellect over the will, but he seemed to have gone to excess in its application, thanks to the influence of Maimonides of the Everestic school and Pseudo-Dionysius. It was also likely that the sermons of St. Bernard exerted a strong influence on Eckhart in questions touching the nature of the mystical experience. Though Eckhart carried the doctrine to the dangerous extremes, Nor should we overlook the fact that Eckhart was very likely acquainted with and perhaps influenced by the spirituality of persons like Margaret Porete, Hagewisch, and Mechtild of Magdeburg, all of whom emphasized very strongly the nothingness of the soul and the necessity of detachment and nudity of spirit. As a result of all these influences was a theology of the spiritual life based on two different but complementary themes: the highly speculative mysticism of essence and the spirituality of the mystical marriage of or Brautmystik. Let us now see how Eckhart attempted to combine these two themes in his spiritual teaching. In God, says Eckhart, esse and intelligere are identical. Moreover, outside of God there is no true existence or being. Esse est Deus. Consequently, all creation, including man, considered in itself is nothing. Whatever it has to being or existence comes from God, in whose divine intellect it was existed from all eternity. Consequently, man is impelled by the necessity of his own nothingness to speak, to return to God in whom he has his source. The point of contact is the radical capacity for union between man and God is found in the essence of the intellect, which is designed variously as a power, a spark, or the Grund der Seele. As Eckhart says, there is something in the soul that is uncreated and uncreatable, namely the intelligence, and if that were the whole soul, that too would be uncreated and uncreatable. The spark or Grund constitutes the seed of divine life and of the properly contemplative life, which can be attained by means of a Platonic type of development. Eckhart constantly reverts to these two basic themes of transcendency of God and total detachment required for man's return to the unity and image of God by participation. Consequently, though at times his manner of speaking was excessive and could be interpreted in a pantheistic sense, Eckhart preserved the concept of a transcendent God and placed limitations on the degree of union between the soul and God. This is evident from his response to the judges at the time of the investigation at Cologne. In his explanation of the precise nature of the union between God and the soul, Eckhart states that the mystical experience flows from grace as supernatural principle and involves immediately an intellectual or contemplative activity on the part of man, though not excluding the activity of the will under the imperation of charity. Thus, through love and vision, the soul that attains to the height of mystical union with God is, as it were, identified with the divine essence. It experiences complete beatitude in and through God. This does not mean, as Eckhart explained in his response to the judges at Cologne, that we are transformed and changed into God, but just as the numerous hosts on various altars are transformed into the one and saved body of Christ, so also, by the grace of adoption, we are united to the true Son of God and made members of the one head of the Church, who is Christ. Eckhart came not only very close to pantheistic doctrine in his manner of expression, he also savored somewhat of the quietism of the Begghards, which he actually condemned with all his strength. The heterodox Begghards taught that man in the present life is able to reach such a high a degree of perfection that he is absolutely impeccable and can attain no further increase of grace. He is no longer obliged to obey the church or any moral laws because he is above them. Whatever acts he may perform are fully in accord with the divine will. Several of Eckhart's statements, condemned by the church, do admit of a quietist interpretation. There is a wide divergence of views concerning the teachings of Eckhart, according to Denifl, Herter, and Mandonet. Eckhart was a scholastic of little originality, and he was not a mystic. Rather, he was a man of mediocre intelligence and unrestrained in his expressions. According to De Wolf, Delacroix, Weber, and Otto, he was orthodox in his intention, but voiced the heretical teachings of Erigena and Almeric, and in that respect is a forerunner of Luther. Finally, Gilson, Dempf, and Graefe maintain that Eckhart was Catholic in his teaching, but not properly understood. He is seen by some as the precursor of Kant, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, Hegel, Heidegger, and Jasper. It is difficult to understand how a man credited with such influence on later thinkers could be branded a mediocre thinker. Rather, it would seem more accurate to take Eckhart at his word and say that although he may have expressed himself in exaggerated terms, he never intended to veer from orthodox teaching. The fact is that his doctrine exerted a profound influence on the spiritual teaching and practice of later ages. John Tauler considered Eckhart his master and teacher, but did not fall into the excesses of Eckhart. Tauler was a preacher and spiritual director, not a writer. With Henry Suso, he was the founder of the Friends of God. The Institutiones Divinae, attributed to Tauler, was composed by the Carthusian Lawrence Surius from the Sermons of Tauler. Like Eckhart, Tauler discussed abstract themes and favored Neoplatonic expressions, although he had a capacity for illustrating his doctrine by simple, picturesque examples. Like Eckhart also, he emphasizes the need for total renunciation of all externals to attain nudity of spirit and an interior recollection or withdrawal into the Grund of the soul, where one attains mystical contemplation. God, says Tauler, is nothing, in the sense that he is nothing we can name, comprehend, or experience as long as we have not attained that nudity of spirit which is essential for contemplation. Meanwhile, we can know what God is not, rather than what he is. Consequently, our knowledge of God is by way of eminence and not by way of analogy with created things. Therefore, until the intelligence of man is completely emptied of all sensible and intellectual images, it cannot contemplate God, because God is not knowable in that way. Only through nudity of spirit can the intelligence become sufficiently passive and receptive so that it can experience intimate union with God. Man, on the other hand, lives on three levels, the sensible, the rational, and the superior level called Gemut. By means of mortification and renunciation, a man rises above the intelligibility of ideas and images so that he can enter into the Grund of the soul. This involves a detachment from the lower appetites, but active asceticism and of the will by total submission to the divine will. It is just as impossible to give a name to the Grund of the soul as if it were to give a name to God. But the Grund, or the center of the soul, is distinct from its faculties, though it gives them their power of operation. The Gemut, on the other hand, is something more powerful than the faculties of the soul, and can be constantly operative even when the intellect and the will are dormant. The Grund of the soul is the area of mystical experience. Since the intellect and will cannot touch the Grund, or the center of the soul, the contemplative experience is something beyond the natural facilities of the soul. Now, we exist in God from all eternity as an idea in the divine intellect, which is identical with the divine existence. Hence, from all eternity, we are united with God, and our task on earth is to return to unity with the divine. This is achieved when the individual returns to the Grund, or the center of the soul, where the Trinity dwells. But since the intellect and the will cannot enter the Grund to make contact with the Trinity, it is the function of two gifts of the Holy Spirit, understanding and wisdom, to lead the soul to its center, beyond every form of human life or knowledge, to that abyss where God gives himself as he is, and is known as he is in himself. This constitutes the mystical union in contemplation, in which no created thing intervenes between God and the soul. The divine essence is immediately united to the soul in its center. Tauler's doctrine was not free from attack, but it was defended by Blosius, St. Peter Canisius, and the Carthusian Lawrence Surius. During the 16th century, the sermons of Tauler were condemned or forbidden in France, Spain, and Belgium, and in the 17th century his teaching was perverted by the Quietists. Indeed, until the 19th century, and then thanks to scholars like Denifl, who restored Tauler to his rightful place in Orthodox theology, the doctrine of Tauler was generally seen under the cloud of Quietism. Nevertheless, Crisogono de Jesus maintains that Tauler, with Ricebrook, was the greatest mystic prior to St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. Henry Suso, 1295 to 1366, whom Strauss calls the singer of German mysticism, a spiritual troubadour, the last poet of Mittelhochdeutsch, and was very likely at some time or another a fellow student with Tauler under Meister Eckhart. His life was filled with mystical phenomena and intense suffering. His written works comprise the following: the Little Book of Eternal Wisdom, Little Book of Truth, Little Book of Letters, and an autobiography which is of dubious authorship. The Little Book of Truth gives us a road map of Suso's high flights into the philosophical and theological speculations. The Little Book of Eternal Wisdom depicts him as a prudent ascetic and practical mystic. In his sermons and letters, we learn to know him as a trenchant preacher and enlightened spiritual guide, endowed with rare charisms. The life unfolds the successive developments of his ascent to holiness. Suso wrote from personal experience, and while he lacks the forcefulness of Eckhart and the clarity of Tauler, he possesses the same sweetness, almost to the point of naivete. He is more of a poet and a mystic than a systematic theologian. In Eternal Wisdom, He begins by advocating meditation of the mysteries, and especially the sufferings, of Jesus and Mary, which should lead the soul to an awareness of the malice of sin, the rigor of divine judgment, and the need for reparation. After offering practical counsel on how to live and how to die, he returns again to meditations on the passion and the death of Christ and the sorrows of Mary. In the Little Book of Truth, he speaks of the grades of prayer and ecstasies and raptures, but warns against the illusion of extraordinary mystical phenomena and the dangers of the excessive passivity of quietism taught by the Begghards and the Brethren of the Free Spirit. For Suso, union with God requires that man be reborn, and this calls for renunciation to such a degree that the soul loses awareness of self as distinct from God and experiences a transformation in Christ. The contemplative experience is indescribable, but it consists in a union with God, the one and the nothing, without an intermediary. The faculties are absorbed in God, so to speak, and the soul is submerged in God. Yet the soul knows and loves God in his experience without understanding what it knows and loves. Even if the soul reaches the sublime union with the divine, there is always the need for humility, because there is always the possibility of sin. Henry Suso wrote from personal experience of the mystical life with such ardor and effusiveness that one would think his entire life was one uninterrupted rapture. Yes, when one considers the asceticism and penitentialism practices of Henry Suso and the false accusations brought against him, what stands out above everything else is his heroic fortitude. Even within his own Dominican order, he was persecuted and deprived of his teaching position and his academic degree as lector in theology. He taught the Pauline doctrine of conformity to Christ, and in his sufferings he gave witness to the passion and death of Christ. Henry Suso was beatified by Pope Gregory XVI in 1831. A great number of the other disciples of Eckhart are as yet unknown, and their works are only partially preserved. One of the works, Theologia Germanica, probably written at Frankfurt around 1350 by a disciple of Eckhart, is a jewel of spirituality that was so highly esteemed by Martin Luther that he published an incomplete version of it in 1518. The work is a manual for ordinary Christians and treats of the interior life in a manner more traditional than that of Eckhart, Toller, or Suso. It follows the division of the purgative, illuminative, and unitive ways, and emphasizes the central role of Christ in the journey to perfection. Man in himself is nothing. Only God, the perfect being, is the all. In becoming more and more aware of his nothingness, man becomes increasingly humble. Hence, humility is the door to the reunification and self-abandonment, which enable a man to empty himself of self and be filled with God. When that happens, God's allness replaces man's nothingness, so that man is, so to speak, divinized. Ruysbroek. The first country outside Germany to receive the influence of the Rhineland mystics was the Netherlands. although it is likely that the origin of the Flemish mystics go back to the 13th century. The most influential mystical writer was John Ruysbroek, who spent a good part of his life as a hermit and died as a canon of St. Augustine in an abbey which he founded at Groenendael. In 1908, Rome approved the cult given him as a blessing. Although he is in the direct line of the Rhineland mystic, some authors hail Ruysbroek as the leader of a distinctive school of spirituality, the Flemish school, and the founder of Devotio Moderna. He is at least a transition point between the Rhineland mystics and Gerard Groot. Besides the German writers, Ruysbroek was also indebted to other sources: St. Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, St. Bernard and the Victorines. Like the Rhineland mystics, the intent of his writings was to explain how and to what degree a man can achieve union with God, yet always avoiding any taint of pantheism. Indeed, he states specifically in the Book of the Highest Truth, no creature can be or become holy to the point of losing its created nature and becoming God. He had a great reverence for tradition and asserted that mysticism without a historical sense is a source of pride and error. Ruysbroek's spiritual doctrine involves three elements: exemplarism, introversion, and union. The basis of exemplarism is the Trinity. The intimate life of the Trinity is ebb and flow, going out and return, originated in the unity of the Godhead, which proceed the three divine persons, who as Trinity return to the unity of infinite perfection. Man can share somehow in this divine life and movement because of an exemplary idea existing in the divine intellect. The human soul comes forth from God and Creator and possesses the three spiritual faculties of intellect, memory, and will. But the human soul must regain its unity, and it does this by means of introversion, returning to the interior by three stages: the active life, the interior life, and the contemplative life. The active life is the life of the virtues. The interior life is the life of grace and imitation of Christ. The contemplative life is the tasting and experiencing of God. To make progress in the spiritual life, one must despoil himself of all egoism and attachment to created things. When he can receive the life of the Father as communicated by the Son and the Holy Spirit, this constitutes the life of union with God, which is so intimate that it transcends all purely emotional experience, and yet the soul always recognizes this life as something distinct from his own. Of the written works of Ruysbroek, 12 treatises are extant, and we shall discuss only the most important. The treatise entitled Kingdom of the Lovers of God contains Ruysbroek's doctrine on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, but because of certain obscurities, he followed it with the Book of the Highest Truth. His intention in the latter work is to explain the three phases of contemplative union with God through an intermediary, without an intermediary, without difference or distinction. Union through an intermediary is effected through the grace of God and the works of virtue, presupposing death to sin and to every disordered appetite of man's lower nature. Union without intermediary occurs when the soul is united with God through the total capacity of its love and experiences. This love in the depth of its being. The symbol used is that of iron in the fiery furnace, which becomes so aflamed that it is indistinguishable from the flames. Union without difference or distinction is the most intimate union that is possible between the soul and God, but it always respecting the principle that no created being can become one in essence with God. This is the union for which God prayed when he asked the Father and his disciples should be one in him as he is one with the Spirit. Roy Speck's masterpiece, The Adornment of the Spiritual Marriage, known in English as the Spiritual Espousals, was written against the brethren of the Free Spirit who followed the heretic teachings of Blomardine. What is of interest in this work is Roy Brooks' descriptive of the active life, the interior life, and the contemplative life. The primary functions of this active life are death to sin, growth in virtue, presupposing, of course, the infusion of grace in the conversion to God. The spiritual powers that are most important at this stage of the spiritual life are the moral virtues, particularly the virtue of humility. The goal sought is union with God through faith, hope, and charity, simulated by desire to see and know Christ as he is in himself. The interior life is one in which the soul, illumined by grace and purified by Christ in the lower faculties, rids itself of all images and distracting occupations. The superior powers of the intellect, memory, and will have been so purified and intensified that the soul experiences the divine touch at its very center and recognizes the call to even more intimate union and the promise of mystical experience. The call is realized and the promise is fulfilled in the contemplative life, where the soul experiences super-essential contemplation of the divine essence in the full divine light and in a divine mode. The soul enjoys an encounter with the divine in the center of the soul. The doctrine of Ruysbroeck, especially as expounded in the third book of the Spiritual Marriage, was attacked by Gerson as pantheistic, but was defended by John of Schoonhoven, Henry Herp, and Dennis the Carthusian. Some have not hesitated to give him the title the Saint Aquinas of mystical theology, and to place him above Saint Bernard and Saint John of the Cross.